Welcome to a special Halloween episode of Manifesting History, where we veer off the usual ghost spectrum and delve into another corner of the supernatural. Journey into the mysterious and blood-chilling world of legends and folklore of vampires. Throughout history, cultures from all corners of the earth have woven tales of these nocturnal blood-sucking creatures, each with their own unique twist on the vampire myth. From the aristocratic vampires of Eastern Europe to the ageless predators that stalked New Orleans, these legends have fueled our nightmares for centuries. If you're ready, let's manifest the haunting history of the vampire legend. Vampires, whether in fiction or reality, take various forms. In the case of New Orleans, a city with a dark history of hauntings, the story of the Carter brothers sheds light on the notion of real-life vampires, as well as the city's peculiar character. In 1932, a young girl ran down Royal Street, claiming to have been held captive by two brothers, the Carters, along with other victims, so that the brothers could drink their blood. Skeptical but intrigued, the police followed her to the Carter brothers' home, discovering 4 half-dead victims bound with blood-soaked bandages and a chilling odor of death in the air. The brothers had the same ritual each night. Once the sun went down, they reopened their victim's wound, collected their blood, and redressed the injuries. Unaware that the girl had escaped, the brothers returned to their macabre activities, but this time the police discovered them. Unfortunately, some of the victims succumbed to their blood loss. The brothers confessed to being vampires, explaining that their thirst for blood was beyond their control. They were tried as serial killers, convicted, and eventually executed. But the brothers aren't the only so-called vampires of New Orleans. The legend of the Casket Girls lives on to this day, and if you'd like to hear more of their tale, be sure to watch my Haunted New Orleans video. In the early 1900s, there was a man that lived in New Orleans that many claimed was a vampire. He was the mysterious Comte de Saint-Germain, a self-proclaimed alchemical master who claimed to have lived for centuries. He allegedly spent time in New Orleans under the name Jacques Saint-Germain. This alchemical prowess and seemingly extensive knowledge of history and future events made him an enigmatic figure. Saint-Germain's parties were notorious, and he was known to drink what guests assumed was red wine, while regaling guests with detailed historical accounts. A bizarre incident occurred at one of his parties when a woman leapt from his balcony, claiming to have been attacked by a vampire. The police investigated but didn't question Saint-Germain immediately, only to discover his sudden disappearance the next day. His residence contained wine bottles filled with human blood. In the 11th century, a disturbing myth spread across Eastern Europe, where the dead were believed to rise from the graves as blood-sucking monsters. Anti-vampire rituals such as driving metal rods through skeletons were common, but the question of how the living identified potential vampires remained unanswered. To investigate this, researchers examined biochemical analysis of bones from so-called vampire graves in northwestern Polish cemeteries. They identified 6 unusual skeletons dated between the 17th and 18th centuries, with sickles placed across their necks or rocks stacked under their chins, suggesting efforts to keep them buried. Tooth enamel tests revealed that all 6 vampires were likely local residents. Surprisingly, these individuals weren't suspected of being vampires due to being outsiders, but were distrusted members of the local community. The researchers speculate that the first victims of cholera epidemics, which were poorly understood at the time, might have been labeled as vampires due to the lack of scientific explanations for their deaths. In June of 2023, in the northwestern village of Luzino, Poland, archaeologists have uncovered what's referred to as mass vampire graves. These 450 individuals were interred with decapitated skulls positioned between their legs, and coins were placed in their mouths, all as an elaborate precaution to prevent these alleged vampires from returning to terrorize the living. Polish folklore speaks of wieski, or vampires, as ghostly figures haunting moonlit streets and malevolent creatures lurking in ancient crypts, emerging at night to prey on unsuspecting souls. The mass grave discovery highlights the prevalence of these practices in rural 19th century Poland, where decapitation was a common method for dealing with perceived vampires, and coins in the mouth were thought to be counteract to the vampire's curse. The belief in the vampire's curse was so deeply ingrained that families sometimes exhumed and beheaded their own deceased relatives after their funerals. The archaeologists also encountered the remains of a decapitated woman with a child's skull placed in her chest, showcasing the extreme measures taken to protect against the vampire's curse. Additionally, around 30% of the skeletons discovered had bricks placed near their legs, arms, and heads, another drastic effort to confine vampires to their resting places. Throughout Europe, various methods and practices evolved to prevent vampires from returning from the dead. Beyond decapitation and coin placement, these range from wooden stakes through the heart to burning cursed remains and using steel rods to pin or lock vampires in their graves. In the context of Polish folklore, bricks were believed to hold mystical power over vampires, serving as spiritual barriers to keep the undead from escaping their resting places. Bohemian folklore has long featured the theme of vampires dating back to the 11th century. These creatures were once believed in and feared throughout Bohemia and Czechoslovakia until the late 19th century. While today vampires are considered mythical, history is filled with accounts and testimonies asserting to their existence. The earliest reference to vampires was in 1047 with the words upierlichi, meaning wicked vampire in Russian, Czech, and Slovakian. However, the term didn't enter the English language until 1734. The 13th century saw a tale of vampirism in Lvova, Czechoslovakia, where a vampire attacked sleeping women and children before returning to his crypt. A hunter from Hungary defeated the vampire by stealing his shroud and beheading him. In 1337, Bohemia experienced vampire hysteria at a church in Opernawich, which ceased after exorcism and protection with holy water and crucifixes. English occult writer Montague Summers claimed Bohemia was a hub of vampire beliefs and activities, supported by historical and recent findings. Vampire graves with dismembered and staked skeletons have been unearthed by archaeologists, bearing testimony to ancient beliefs in vampires. Modern accounts of vampirism still persist, leaving the question of their existence unanswered. In 1892, tuberculosis held the grim distinction of being the primary cause of death in the United States. The fear surrounding this horrific death played a role in the unsettling events that transpired in a small town of Exeter, Rhode Island, at the close of the 19th century. Residents became convinced that a vampire, named Mercy Brown, was responsible for the consumption-related deaths in the town, despite the fact that she had already succumbed to the same disease. The origins of this tragedy can be traced back to a farmer named George Brown, who lost his wife Mary Eliza to tuberculosis in 1884. 2 years later, his oldest daughter met the same fate. As time passed, more members of the Brown family perished, fueling suspicions that something far more sinister was at play. The situation grew dire when George Brown's son, Edwin, fell seriously ill in 1891. The following year, Edwin's sister Mercy Lena Brown also fell ill from tuberculosis and died at the age of 19, intensifying her father's desperation. Local folklore, meanwhile, persisted, suggesting that the deceased might still contain flesh and blood that fed on the living in feeble health. This superstition proposed that when family members wasted away from consumption, it would be due to one of the deceased draining the life force from their living kin. Eventually, after repeated urgings from concerned townspeople, the bodies of George Brown's wife and daughters were exhumed and examined by a local doctor. While the skeletons of the wife and eldest daughter were found, Mercy Brown's 9-week-old remains appeared remarkably well preserved, with blood in her heart and liver. This seemed to validate the local belief that she was a vampire, siphoning life from her living relatives. Despite the doctor's attempts to rationalize the preservation as a result of the cold winter burial, superstitious locals insisted on removing Mercy Brown's heart and liver, burning them, and mixing the ashes with water, which they then fed to Edwin. Tragically, this supernatural remedy failed to save him, and he passed away just 2 months later. The exhumation and burning of the deceased due to fears of vampire-like entities were not uncommon in many Western countries until the early 20th century. Although the Mercy Brown case was not unique, it marked the conclusion of an era of these vampire-inspired rituals. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a wealthy Hungarian noblewoman with royal connections, including an uncle who was King of Poland and a nephew who was a Prince of Transylvania. In 1610, she faced allegations of gruesome serial murders and was confined to her home in Castle Chakite until her death. Bathory is infamous for being considered one of the most prolific female murderers in history, with claims of at least 600 victims. Her heinous acts earned her the nickname the Blood Countess. Bathory faced a litany of accusations involving assaults and murders of female servants and young noblewomen who sought her protection. Some of the reported tortures included victims being smeared with honey and left outside for insects, forced into deadly ice baths during colder months, subjected to needle piercings, facial mutilations, whippings with stinging nettles, and even biting and burning. But the most infamous claim is that Bathory bathed in the blood of virgin victims to regain her youth. She would have the women stripped down by servants, and then their throats and wrists would be slit by Bathory herself. One servant claimed to witness Bathory even drinking the blood on one occasion. In 1610, the count responsible for judicial matters in Hungary arrived at the castle to investigate Bathory's crimes against noble women. She was found in the act of tormenting a victim and subsequently imprisoned in her home due to her high status. 4 of her servants, including 3 women and a man, were arrested, questioned, and subjected to torture. They admitted to burying multiple victims, but shifted blame to Bathory and each other, implicating the deceased servant, Dracula, who had served as a maid and governess. It is said that Dracula would lure women to Bathory. After questioning, the servants were executed. Another woman, believed to have aided Bathory through magic, was also put to death. The Count continued his investigation, and one witness claimed that Bathory had documented 650 victims, although the number varied in other accounts. Despite these witness testimonies, Bathory's exact death toll remains uncertain. The evidence gathered by the Count included 289 witness statements. As a member of a powerful family, Bathory was not put on trial, but isolated or possibly walled up in her castle, where she remained until her death in 1614. Her holdings passed to family members instead of being seized due to her lack of a criminal conviction. Fear of vampires took root amongst the Venetians, who believed that some of the skeletons discovered in a mass grave exhibited peculiar traits. Certain remains bore large rocks wedged between their jaws, sparking the belief that these individuals were vampires. The Black Death claimed the lives of more than 50 million people across Europe. Venice, Italy was hit particularly hard. A third of its population fell victim to the plague. An island known as Poveglia was used as the final living quarters for the infected and inevitably became their final resting place. The bodies were placed in mass graves on the island. These graves were constantly being dug up so that more bodies could be added. Decomposing gases caused internal organ rupture, sometimes expelling blood from the body and mouth. Thus, when the Venetians reopened the plague pits to inter more victims, they occasionally encountered cadavers with bloody mouths, resembling creatures that had recently feasted on human flesh. Additionally, the fluid often moistened the burial shroud near the corpse's mouth, causing the cloth to sag into the jaw. This created the appearance that the corpse had been gnawing on its shroud. Vampires were sometimes believed to be the cause of plagues, and there was a superstition that chewing on a shroud was the magical way that vampires spread infection. Placing objects like bricks and stones into the mouths of alleged vampires was thought to prevent the spread of disease. This frightened the gravediggers so much that rocks would be jammed into the mouths of the dead bodies to prevent further preying on the living. Archaeologists discovered the skull of a female while excavating graves on the Venetian island of Lazaretto Nuovo. The skeleton unearthed had been suspected of being a vampire, but may also have been accused of practicing witchcraft. Her remains were found among victims of the medieval plague, and her jaw had been propped open using a brick. Further investigations revealed that the woman was between 61 and 71 years old at the time of her death. Scientists were surprised by this finding, as women of such advanced ages were rare in the 16th century. In medieval Europe, during a period when fear of witches was widespread, many believed that witches had received magical powers from the devil, including the ability to evade death. This suggests that an older woman like her, who was suspected of being a vampire after death, might have also faced accusations of witchcraft during her lifetime. In March of 1969, Highgate Cemetery on the outskirts of London became the focal point of a series of eerie events. Reports of a tall black apparition wandering amongst the graves started circulating and drew the attention of the British Psychic and Occult Society. Many accounts seemed to be rooted in local gossip, but an individual soon came forward claiming to have had a first-hand encounter with what became known as the Highgate Vampire. According to this witness, he felt hypnotized by a lurking presence, lost his way, and sensed something following him in the darkness. As he turned to look, he spotted a tall black figure that promptly disappeared. Subsequently, 2 teenage boys reported seeing spirits of dead rising from their graves. An elderly woman also claimed to have been frightened by a tall, dark man with glaring eyes while walking her dog within the cemetery's gates. Numerous foxes were also turning up dead with deep throat lacerations. For months, nothing else happened until August 1970. 2 schoolgirls stumbled upon the corpse of a woman who had been decapitated, staked through the heart, and left in the middle of the pathway. This gruesome discovery prompted police investigation and reignited vampire sightings, with one woman claiming she was attacked by a tall, pale figure cloaked in black. In response, the British Psychic and Occult Society agreed to conduct a psychic seance in Highgate Cemetery to exorcise the entity. However, the seance was disrupted by police and the society's leader was arrested. To this day, strange stories of a dark figure spotted in Highgate Cemetery continue. Centuries ago, a widespread belief existed that vampires not only drank blood but also carried the plague. As we already discovered in places like Italy and Poland, precautions such as placing a brick in the corpse's mouth to prevent them from feasting on the living were implemented. Recently, archaeologists unearthed 2 8th-century skeletons in Ireland, with rocks inserted into their mouths. What makes this discovery intriguing is that it predates the emergence of vampire folklore, unlike the Italian finding from the 16th century. In the 8th century, the fear of vampires was not widespread, making these skeletons particularly enigmatic. One of the men was between 40 and 60 years old, and the other was a young adult, probably between 20 and 30 years old. The 2 men were laid side by side, and each had a baseball-sized rock thrust into his mouth, explained the head archaeologist. The common notion is that the practice of placing rocks in the mouths of corpses to prevent vampire-like activities took hold during the Middle Ages. However, since these skeletons date back to the 8th century, researchers cannot tie their condition to the vampire hysteria that emerged in the 16th century. The archaeologists speculated that the individuals with stones in their mouths might have been seen as potentially dangerous, possibly enemies or murderers. Such an act could have been a way to prevent their malevolent spirits from escaping the grave, or could it be possible that the fear of vampires could date back to the 8th century? Romania serves as a cradle of vampire lore, sparking the imagination behind countless books, movies, and shows featuring these supernatural beings. Their eerie origins can be traced back to this hauntingly captivating land. The tale of vampires in Romania stretches deep into history, with legends emanating from Transylvania. The region's unique location is believed to enhance the supernatural aura, while mythological stories suggest that vampires emerge on specific dates like St. George's and St. Andrew's Day. Vampires have etched their presence on our screens and in literature for decades. The renowned Count Dracula, created by Bram Stoker, introduced to the world the charismatic yet bloodthirsty vampire in 1897. The novel was Dracula, and it remains one of the most famous horror stories to this day. However, Romania's vampires were not merely the offspring of Stoker's imagination. They've been lurking in the shadows of Romanian folklore for generations. These legends weren't conjured from thin air. They find their roots in the brutal reign of Vlad Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler. The original vampire, Vlad III, earned his infamous nickname, Vlad the Impaler, due to his gruesome method of executing enemies. Born in Transylvania in 1431, his early life was marked by treacherous political maneuvers and imprisonment under the Ottoman Empire, where he witnessed horrific acts that would shape his dark path. As Vlad's father and elder brother met tragic fates, a darkness took hold of him, and he emerged as a merciless murderer. His reign of terror encompassed bloodshed, impalement, and ruthlessness as he defended Wallachia against the Ottomans and dispatched his adversaries with horrifying tactics. And yes, there are historical records that he actually drank the blood of his victims in front of them as they died a slow, agonizing death. Although Vlad's life met a gruesome end at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, his legacy endures, giving birth to the enduring legend of vampires in Romania. In a small village in the 14th century, a woman cried into the street that her baby had been stolen by a wolf that came in through the window. The woods were searched, but no wolf was ever found. People were terrified to later discover that the gravesite of a recently buried young woman was empty. It was believed that she rose from the grave and, taking the shape of a wolf, snatched the infant from its crib. The superstition was further fueled when, after an excavation of the supposed burial site of Vlad Dracula, only animal bones were unearthed. Romania's vampire mythology is steeped in tradition and folklore. Undeniably, Romania's legacy of vampire stories is a treasure trove of the macabre, a realm where darkness and myth intertwine. Vampires have captured the human imagination for centuries, leaving a breadcrumb trail of legends and folklore that span the globe. These bloodthirsty creatures, whether in the form of Eastern European monsters or the seductive Draculas of literature, continue to haunt our dreams and fuel our fascination with the supernatural. From the ominous depths of the Carpathian Mountains to the eerie nights of New Orleans, the enduring mystique of vampires serves as a testament to the enduring power of storytelling, reminding us that the shadows still hold secrets waiting to be uncovered, even in our modern world. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like this video and subscribe if you'd like to see next week's. Until next time, happy hauntings!